But it doesn't get explored much in the big exhibitions. I don't see much art actually going into identity beyond the obvious markers, going into like excavating the contemporary condition, what it is to be a person now.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. I don't need to tell anyone listening that it is a difficult and alarming political moment. You may be asking, how will art weather the storm? To answer that question, you probably need to take stock of how art has navigated the political storms of the recent past. And there's been a lot of debate about this recently, centered on the critic Dean Kissick's long essay for Harper's Magazine from late last year, titled "The Painted Protest: How Politics Ruined Contemporary Art." Kissick first drew major attention as a chronicler of New York's downtown scene in a column he wrote for the art magazine Spike from 2017 to 2022. In his Harper's piece, he narrates being drawn to art in the late 2000s as a space of experimentation and glamour, a spirit, he wrote, that big museums and biennials had lost. Kissick described disaffection from institutions that now focused, in his words, on art dressed up as protest and contextualized through decolonial or queer theory with a singular focus on identity. The essay has been both slammed as carelessly feeding the cultural backlash that's rising all around and hailed for speaking honestly about an art world grown complacent. We already talked about some of this on the Art Angle for our year-end roundup in December. I also started the new year writing my own take titled, "Will the Art World Go Post-Woke in 2025? The reaction to that piece, in turn, led Kissick and I to this discussion. Dean Kissick, thanks for joining us on the Art Angle.
Hi, Ben.
Where are you zooming in from?
I am here in New York for a week and a half, and I'm staying in the Citizen M Hotel on the Bowery, that big red hotel, Bowery and Delancey, on the 8th floor. I've got a great view out west across Soho.
And I can see a great fake Jeff Koons balloon dog bookend behind you. It's a great setting. So you are kind of at the center of the conversation. Your essay from Harper's, the cover story from December, touched off a ton of talk. Within hours of it being published, multiple people had sent me the link and wanted to know what I thought of it. What do you make of the reaction to it, which has been a very sharply polarized reaction, I'd say?
I thought it would have a reaction, but I think it's been a bigger reaction than I was anticipating. And it's gone on for longer than I would have thought. And I think now we're probably at the end of the cycle, which is good. But the reason this conversation came about is because I responded to a Twitter thread that we were both kind of brought into.
Yeah.
By someone I guess we don't know. And it was talking about your response to the piece. I was interested to talk to you about your essay, not just about my piece. I thought your piece was really interesting. I thought it was the best response I've read. You know, it's not just a response, but it's partly a response. You're talking about the larger picture, of course. It was the most interesting response I read. I've read them all, or almost all of them.
Right.
And there have been a lot. So I wanted to talk about that. I didn't think it was that polarizing. Maybe it's become a bit more polarized over time. One of the things that surprised me was that I was criticized from people all over the place, from the left, from the right, from the center, like if we can use those terms. It wasn't like dominated by a thrust of criticism that what I'm saying is dangerous or right-wing or reactionary or I'm a racist, misogynist, transphobe. Of course, there's been some of that. I think there's been a lot less of that than it would have been a few years ago. Actually, a lot of the criticism is just saying, oh, that what I'm saying is obvious. It's been said before, or that like everyone knows this. It's not useful to, that's what your curator friend said to you. It's not useful to make this point. So I didn't think it was polarizing in the sense of two sides. It's kind of people are complaining about it for many very different reasons.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I guess it just shows you how fragmented the discourse is, because I think there's definitely a reaction from some people that is essentially like, finally someone said it. Finally someone said that these shows are bad, or that a lot of recent biennials are bad in the same way, is what I'd say. That they organize themselves around the same themes of marginalized identities, And it feels like that's hit some kind of wall, and that there are various kinds of criticisms that have been disabled, or basically that there's a lot of bad art that passes under the cover of social justice. And I do think that people have been saying that, but it does feel like some people still really are excited to hear that. And I think the fact that your piece appeared in Harper's feels like some kind of signal to people of a turning in the discourse. And then other people saying this is very bad, racist, reactionary, whatever you want to say. I was trying to steer through that. I mean, very specifically in my piece, because I think there have been a lot of silences in the discourse. I mean, I just think that that's indisputably true. I don't think that the essay you wrote is like particularly easy to write. You seem to think that it was easier to write than it would have been 5 years ago. And I think that's probably true because the vibe has shifted. But I don't think it was necessarily like obviously the best career move.
I mean, I think it's a great career move, but I don't care about my career. I'm not trying to build a big career in the art world. I know from personal experience, because I've written on these subjects before, and I've written like maybe slightly controversial pieces before. I did a piece called The Art We Deserve, I think, for Spike, like quite a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
In my experience, writing a piece like this, like being outspoken, causing a stir, it's only going to help your career. I know this because it's happened to me before. I know, like, it would be completely wrong to think that this is some kind of brave career suicide. Like, it'll only lead to more opportunities, more offers of jobs, more invitations, like right to the center of power, like right into the biggest dealers in the world's houses, right into like the gallery dinners and the openings and people wanting to give you money to do various things. I don't really want to do that anymore. That world is not so appealing to me, but I don't want to be here pretending that I've sacrificed my career or anything like that.
That was not what I was exactly trying to say. What I was trying to say is that you can know that you're going to be in for some online unpleasantness. One knows these are very combustible issues. And more than anything else, one knows that there are issues that other people avoid talking about. Or that's how I perceive it. I mean, maybe it's different in your circles. I mean, there's been a whole current of the conversation that you've been part of about the decline of criticism. And I think that's part of the reaction, because I feel like there's always bad art. There are absolutely mediocre art. And I think it's arguable whether there's more or less and what's to blame for that in recent times. But there's definitely a sense that I feel like criticism has kind of rotted, that there's a lot of bad art that goes unquestioned and lazy claims, like big claims for what the art's doing, that go unchallenged. I mean, a line that stood out for me in your essay is, "We lie to one another and to ourselves that all this humdrum work is inspiring and it has an influence on how opinions are formed and hearts are won." But of course it doesn't. And to me, that feels almost as much about the critics and the discourse as it is about the shows themselves. You know, people have just said that to me directly over and over again. There's no negative criticism. Some of the curators of these shows have said that to me, at gallery dinners and so on. Is that your sense of things?
I feel differently about this. Yeah. There's probably not that much negative criticism in art magazines, but I don't know because I don't read a lot of criticism in art magazines, and perhaps you don't either. I don't know if many of the listeners will. I could be wrong. We did a panel together related to the crisis of criticism a year or two ago. What I said then, and I still feel it now, is this is actually a very good time for criticism. I think we do have a fair amount of outspoken criticism. You're one of those critics. I am too. We can talk about people like Jason Farago, The Times, or Sean Tatel, Manhattan Art Review, or many such. There are these outspoken voices, and there are people with independent platforms. So there are people writing for big newspapers who are given platforms to be very critical. And criticism is incentivized, actually. Like, being outspoken is incentivized. Last few months particularly is a good example of that. I came and I wrote this critical piece and it blew up. People want it. It's incentivized. I will be rewarded for it. Perhaps I wasn't actually that critical. Perhaps I should be more critical. A period I write about a lot in this Harper's essay is the mid-2010s. I was excited by the art at the time, which is not to say I think we should go back there. But as I recall, I don't remember reading a lot of negative criticism or like cutting harsh takedowns then. I think we have much more outspoken criticism now than them. And I actually think the progressive turn in art reintroduced like real vicious criticism and real takedowns to the art world. I think when you started denouncing people, when artists started being criticized for being seen as in some way transgressing boundaries or being problematic, I think that was the thing that brought far more critical voices back in, brought like a more vicious criticism. I think we do have that now.
Well, I mean, I guess the question is whether that criticism was on the basis of the art or on the basis of who was making the art, the kinds of politics it was embedded in. People have been talking about for quite some time, a decline in people's ability to talk about form.
Yeah, for sure.
And that gets tangled up with all these political conversations about the political pressures on art, the discourse around identity politics, and so on.
Yeah.
That moment in the mid-2010s that you speak about, nostalgically in the piece.
No, not nostalgically. But go on.
You
I don't want to go back there. I don't want to go back there at all.
Being an artist seemed like the greatest thing you could possibly be.
Yeah. But I wasn't an artist. But yeah.
I just think some of that toppled over of its own kind of in relationship to the changing political moment. I mean, Jason Farrago, who you mentioned earlier, writes for the Times now. I think he kind of made his name with an extremely negative review of the Berlin Biennial in
2016 for The Guardian, right? A great piece.
That opens with saying, like all this post-internet art, experimental, some of the kind of art that you write about in your Harper's piece as having fallen out of favor. The very first paragraph of that review is like talks about, migrants dying in the sea, in the Mediterranean, and, how it just feels irresponsible and lazy and out of touch to be making this kind of art now. And I mean, that, I guess, to me, stood out as something not in your Harper's piece. It's subtitled How Politics Ruined Contemporary Art. Talks about identity politics. But like, what happened? What reckoned with what actually happened in this moment? Like why it took this form, why there are these silences in the conversation. That to me seems like pretty clear what happened. The optimism of the pre-2016 period, optimism of Obama-era America, and, those kind of dreams of a post-racial kind of moment just ran aground on the fact that the world was full of these big problems, and the Black Lives Matter movement threw into relief how white and limited some of the things in art were, and people were scrambling to catch up with that conversation. And Trump came in, and people panicked, and these institutions became a lot more fragile. And I try and bring that out in my essay, I guess. That's what I thought I was contributing.
Yeah, I liked that. I liked your narrative of the last 10 years. Can you recount it a bit now? It would be good to talk about that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that more than 10 years ago now, 15 years ago now, there started to develop a strong sense that these big art events, which are the center of your narrative, weren't very representative.
Mm-hmm.
White men were the center of them. And that was just clear. You could count the numbers. I wrote articles like that. Lots of people did. Same's true of art criticism for that matter. And then these events, starting with the Whitney Biennial in 2013, were consumed by controversies over race and how unrepresentative they were. Then the election of Trump arrived, and I think the discourse very quickly turned in on itself. Started out as being about what can we do in culture and arts in order to do something about what most people in the arts viewed as a terrible calamity. And then it turns out you can't really do that much about it from the point of view of cultural consumption or the arts. And furthermore, all the things people were blaming for Trump at that time, the mainstream discourse, he represented misogyny and whiteness and reaction. The art world hadn't dealt with those issues, so people just pushed the button really hard on trying to engage that conversation. And in some ways it had a huge positive effect, but it also was part of this whole turn in the culture that ultimately, put so much pressure on cultural consumption, on the idea of the ethics of cultural consumption, of representation as kind of a reparations in a lot of different ways. And that produced just a ton of contradictions. I don't think the art world has reckoned with those last 5 years very well, in that a lot of very ethical, almost revolutionary talk in public that was full of contradictions and weird silences and ass covering. And I think to a lot of people observing, the discourse felt suddenly very hard to have honest conversations in, felt very shallow, making very loud moral claims are very shallow, felt in some cases very cynical. There are moments where at a certain point, I remember Jeff Bezos shooting some paintings by Amoako Boafo, the Ghanaian painter, into space and issuing a press release saying like space tourism was all about Black joy. And you have people looking on who are trying to figure out their career, figure out a way forward. And the conversation is just very hard to navigate in an honest way, and a lot of people becoming disillusioned and jaded with progressive politics itself. And I think that you've seen that in this recent election. And I think that's some of the reason for like some of the intense reaction to your essay is that it did come out in December 2024, right after this election. You're talking about identity politics, and here that's a very big part of the political conversation, and people are looking at, Meta ending its hate speech guidelines and rolling back diversity, and hear people talking about that identity politics is a problem in art. And naturally, they connect those two things, right?
Yeah. I wrote this before the election. As you know, and you've said this, I think you said this on the ArtNet end of the year. I wrote it long before the election, and it took a while to write. It was delayed because I went to these shows. I went to the Biennale in April and Whitney before that, but then I had to move back to England. So everything, like the piece was pushed back like a fair few months because I had to like make a lot of changes in my life. When I was writing it, it was a Democratic presidency. I think Biden was still the candidate when I was writing it. So we seem to be in a different era now, actually, but no one knows yet what form it's going to take. Definitely seem to be entering a different cultural era. The kind of writing I'm doing in this piece is perhaps not going to be a big part of this era, in the same way that, we're probably going to move beyond this kind of superficial forms of identity politics in art. We're probably also going to move beyond the kind of critiques of it, or like anti-woke culture as seeming in some way transgressive or interesting. And I think all of that is done. I liked your story of the last 10 years, and I agree. You talk about Hannah Black and others' protest of the 2017 Whitney Biennial over the Danish Shuts painting, and you talk about Hannah and Toby Haslett and Kieran Finlayson's protest of the tear gas biennial. The protest in 2017, it's the most important thing. As in, when we tell the story of 2010s art, contemporary art in the 2010s, that's a big story, I think. When you look back on this decade,
I agree.
That's what changed everything. It's the most significant thing that happened in art. And it's interesting that it wasn't an artwork. It was by an artist, but it wasn't an artwork. Now you have Nan Golden, protest for Palestine at the Neue National Gallery in Berlin. This is this huge thing that happened, but it's a protest. I was told she considers everything she does a part of her practice, from the works she exhibits to the activism to the protests. I went to Austria for Spike's birthday. Someone said to me that she was the most high-profile person to speak out for Palestine in Germany. Like, not the most high-profile art person, but she's the highest-profile person of any world who's issued a statement like that, which is interesting. Maybe that connects to something which you were saying also in the end-of-year roundup on this podcast, that Palestine is the biggest story. That's the biggest issue in the art world now. The US election is no longer the biggest issue. That's quite a significant shift. Like, the whole American politics has been dominating everything, and the whole world, the art world certainly, is just downstream of whatever's happening in America. It's no longer the case that US politics is the biggest story. And perhaps it's no longer going to be the case that everything's downstream of America or what's happening in New York. Though I suspect it will remain so.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think it's interesting to think when it comes to your essay and the question about like identity and art. I mean, I do think those questions take different forms on either side of the Atlantic, or certainly in other parts of the world that aren't Europe or America. There are different conversations about these questions, and there's a certain kind of way of thinking about these things that's very American, that's been exported through the discourse, I believe, that people view as an export through our academic institutions, through our cultural institutions. But just to go back to something you said at the beginning about how maybe this won't be the discourse, I agree. The Hannah Black protests in 2017, which is just after Trump, so really opened this moment, that just absolutely defined the time to come. But in a way, there was explicit conversations about it, and then there was a lot of conversations that just weren't had in public or had on social media. And it took people years to write books about, just a couple of years ago, books by academics started coming out trying to provide their way of thinking about this problem, because it really, I think, was concussive. It was experienced as a sharp turn in the discourse. All these academics, thinkers who've been popular in art, they just didn't think about identity this way, or the demands being placed on art, on the institution, hybridity, mixing. In the entire postmodern term, would have thought about the kind of authenticity that was being demanded of art as representation, as kind of reactionary. And then here it was being made in this kind of righteous form, and people just didn't know their way through that discourse. And then they were hit by more protests over patronage. And I think this just left a lot of contradictions for institutions, that a lot of time people who aren't even engaged with these protests are cheering them on from the sidelines and just not even acknowledging their contradictions. That museums are being asked to give up all their funding, but also to completely change their program, which is going to take a lot of money. Or museums are being asked to completely incorporate all this art by artists of color and women that was left out of the canon, the traditional canon. But some of the same people are making the demands. It's art is a reactionary thing to begin with. Showing objects is just bougie stuff, and they ought to be like daycare centers. Museums should transform themselves into social service organizations. These are all contradictions that are kind of unvoiced. And I think leaves for a lot of people looking on from the sidelines without having these conversations openly, saying, this social justice discourse is a bunch of hooey. It's just a bunch of just emotionally draining stuff I don't want to have anything to do with. And I don't really find it pleasant to write about this stuff.
Yeah.
I don't like making myself a target for this. Maybe I'm projecting onto you my own feeling that I don't want to stick my neck up about this stuff because, look, I'm a white guy writing about issues of race. I'm aware of the problems with that or what people might say about that. For a long time, I think a lot of people are this discourse sucks. There are problems with it, but maybe I should just focus on trying to solve some of the behind the scenes problems, make things more equitable. That's a very difficult problem to solve, You can make incremental progress towards a more diverse, inclusive art world, but ultimately it floats atop of a lot of inequality that you can't just solve at the level of ideas. I took your essay as a prompt, not just as a prompt, I would say, but as a signal that you just can't not talk about what people have been talking about behind the scenes, that people are drawing their own conclusions. They're looking in and they're kind of just checking out of stuff I find important. You're a much more of a downtown New York guy. Your column is maybe the best guide to that art scene. I'm disconcerted. The reactionary turn downtown is often overstated, but it is true. You will run into, young women who you're suddenly in a conversation with. They're that's why I hate feminism. That's inconceivable to me. Young, educated, progressive people suddenly think feminism is just obviously lowbrow, stupid. And that's a product of all these conversations that have been had in online spaces. And people have drawn all kinds of conclusions about the cynical motives for certain kinds of social justice. So maybe the museums will be able to turn the page, the institutions will be able to turn the page, but I don't think they've left themselves a lot of runway, because I view what happened in terms of biennials, which is that they became very focused to the exclusion of most other issues on platforming marginalized voices, as more of a defensive reaction than anything else. It's trying to put artists of color between themselves and what they view as the mob. And they push so hard on that button that I believe that from within the institution, it's impossible to let air in without it being viewed as a concession to all this other horrible political stuff going on more broadly. And the only way I view as moving on in a way that might reset the conversation is just have the conversation openly and take my lumps if I need to take my lumps. That's where I was coming from.
Yeah. I don't like this kind of idea that social justice concerns are more important than art itself. The idea that politics is more important than art. I actually believe that art is more important than politics, but not everyone has to go along with that. I think it would be good for museums to care about art first, not about things outside of art, if they're art museums. That's just where I stand. It's not a crazy thing to say, is it? Art museums should care about art most of all. But of course, they don't need to do that. It doesn't matter. But if the museum's primary concern is social justice, making a more equitable world, well, they don't need to pivot from that. Just take it more seriously. Do it better. Be more convincing. Make shows that dazzle people. Make shows that make bold political statements or bold statements about social justice. Not this wishy-washy, empty text that say nothing. Be more political. I don't have a problem with political art, but I think the forms it's kind of taken recently, at least on this high level biennials, it's so superficial and shallow. It doesn't do anything. It's so useless. It actively puts people off. If you care about social justice, you shouldn't like the forms of social justice art that are being pushed because they actively undermine the cause. They are not progressive. They are making serious causes look stupid. They are absolutely useless and counterproductive. And they are turning people against progressive politics and they're turning people against art. That is bad, I think. They're completely self-defeating. It should also be clear, the politics being pushed by the museum are not radical. I'm not going there and seeing some radical leftist project and recoiling in horror, being oh no, I'm a reactionary, the revolution's coming. It is empty centrist nonsense. It's the emptiest liberal platitudes. It's the voice of the DNC. There's nothing radical there. There's nothing revolutionary there. The fact that if you want to say free Palestine, you have to hide it in a flashing sign in a show that's ostensibly about social justice and freedom is completely insane. Completely insane. The fact that you have a show about textile art as protest and progress and artists are pulling out of the so-called political show because it's impossible for them to make a political statement or to speak freely in this museum. It's a failed project. Museums don't need to pivot away, but be more strident and show good art. Everyone knows there's great political art. Everyone knows there's great art about identities. There's nothing wrong with this kind of art, but make something seductive and convincing. Make something that would make me go there and feel uncomfortable, or make me go there and be damn, I'm wrong. I should have never criticized these places.
I think that what you get in these institutional shows is essentially a compromise formation, because of course they can't do that. They're not going to be these bastions of revolution. They're just not. That's not institutionally what they are. I mean, various activist formations have called on museums to become revolutionary organizations. And when you're really honest about what that means, you're just calling them to not exist. You're calling them to completely undo what they do. So they have to find a middle ground. And that middle ground, I think people settled on is because of the obvious historical problems with the exclusion of lots of different kinds of people from art, the overrepresentation of white male artists, they just settled on that as the thing, the progressive case that could be made for art in the last 10 years. And that has just become the story they are telling at the cost of making a lot of that seem really insincere because it does feel a little tokenizing to a lot of artists who are in these shows sometimes, a lot of observers. I quote in my piece the art historian Darby English, who is a historian of Black art and aesthetics, and gave an interview with this website a couple years ago where he says, the discourse has actually gone backwards for Black artists. What you're allowed to say as a Black artist right now, or how you're interpreted, is shockingly narrow. You're allowed to basically interpret the Black experience for the audience, and that seems like a limit that people have placed on things. So I guess my question for you is, the vibe shift, I guess I would say, began in earnest in 2020. At the end of 4 years of Trump, at the beginning of Biden, Biden's already a vibe shift president in the sense that he was the anti-Bernie Sanders. He was promising, you're not going to have to think about politics. I think he literally said that in his election. Aren't you tired of all these debates that happened under the Trump era? And then at the same time, there was, I think, a downtown culture that is totally different than the culture you're talking about in the Harper's essay. But as a lot of your columns for Spike, The Downward Spiral, are about, basically chronicling downtown New York culture. They're a very good record of that time, which is a lot of people looking at the dominant discourse and thinking it sucks. And the silences within the mainstream art discourse created a sense of a counterculture, in my opinion, that a lot of fashion magazines looked at and was like, oh, this is what we've been waiting for. It's like, finally, we don't have to be so earnest. And a lot of culture or political writers looked at it and said, the kids are going fascist. And you've been pretty outspoken that a lot of that is nonsense. You think that the people really overstate the politics of this downtown scene.
Well, at the time, yeah. But I mean, it's kind of come true, hasn't it? So maybe, maybe all the critics were right all along. I mean, there are plenty of Trump supporters in that world.
You think so? I like to have it on the record. Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, no, I mean, I just did the talk with Red Scare. They're Trump supporters, and they went on the kind of Bernie to Trump journey, which at the time, back when Bernie was running, before he even lost, people said, oh, these Bernie bros, they're trouble, they're secretly right-wingers. Like, I always thought that was ridiculous, but actually, so much of that played out. There are, like, open fascists downtown now. They're having, like, open Trump victory parties at Sovereign House. Those people weren't around in 2020, 2021. They weren't here. That space didn't exist. It's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy to some extent. Like, people started talking about this reactionary turn, and it started attracting, like, money. People moved in, started opening spaces. People moved there looking for that. I've been to Clandestino, the Dime Square bar. I don't go to so much now because I can't get a seat. It's too popular. And my friends don't go there, but I have been, and someone at the next table will just start talking to me and they'll start saying crazy shit. I don't want them to be talking to me. I think, wow, what happened to this place? What happened to this world? Sorry, but let me come back a bit more. I should just say for the record that the term vibe shift was coined by this guy, Angelicism01, who's a kind of writer now, sort of artist, lives in Britain, very online, who would write about that scene a lot. Makes a point of provoking, made a point of being edgy, and was very involved in the downtown scene, kind of creating that myth. He's a very political artist now. If you watch Film 01, if you watch The First Cut, I particularly like, that's a film about climate change. It's a film about climate apocalypse. It's very committed, serious political art. And I think it's good. Another thing I would say is, personally, I found that time, 2020, 2021, 2022, in downtown New York, I didn't think it was this crazy reactionary scene. I didn't think it was very political at all. I think it was a pretty apolitical, but I enjoyed it. I thought it was a very exciting time, actually. And I met loads of interesting people. And when people criticize me and say, oh, I long for art world pre-2016, I'm so nostalgic for my 20s. Like, I'm not nostalgic for my 20s at all. I don't want to go back to that art world, but I do long for pandemic New York. That was some of the happiest times of my life. And it was a culturally exciting time. I understand why people don't like it, and maybe it's turned into something ugly. But having moved abroad, now that I live in London, I actually long for that energy of New York at that time. I wished I had a cultural scene to be part of, but I don't.
See, people are always obsessing about right-wing culture. You can argue about people that you have a conversation with politically, that you share values with, and you can argue about strategies. If someone totally disagrees with you about, like, whether women should have equal rights, like, you're just not going to move them. And my perspective is that progressive values got captured by institutional culture, and that has the collateral effect of making progressive values look institutional. They look like your boss's politics and the HR department. And of course, people are going to react to and reject that and find a way to reject girl boss culture. If you're a young person and your boss is a woman and that kind of language is being used to hammer you, you're going to reach for whatever rebels against it. And yeah, I do think that kind of capture of politics by institutional culture leads people also to, like, they want too much of culture. It's like, it should be progressive. And it's like, it's culture. It's going to be a mix of stuff. You look at something like the punk movement, it's not radical in any particular direction. There's reactionary stuff in there. There's progressive stuff in there. There's radical leftist stuff in punk. There's stuff that's not political at all. There are people just there just for a good show and are along for the ride because it's entertaining. And I feel like that's basically what the downtown culture was. It's like a mix of affects of rebellion that we're mixing together with politics. It's just interesting to hear your analysis of it now, because I've quoted your line before that Dimes Square, in scare quotes, has come to be associated with a certain attitude, boredom with performative outrage, and disdain for overbearingly earnest didacticism. But you go on to say, I don't think it represents an opposition to progressive values, but rather a wish to retreat from a culture in which everything is supposed to be political. And I think a lot of people have interpreted you, including interpreting this Harper's essay, as being kind of a dandyish essay that's like kind of wants to retreat to the apolitical cultural space.
Yeah, I do.
Well, yeah, but I feel like that island is shrinking. The world's getting more intense, and I'm personally trying to hold space open for there to be a more complex way you fit some of these parts together. But at the same time, when, like you said, there are actual people talking about like neo-monarchism and stuff, and that's become articulated with some of this rejection of people's feelings of exclusion from institutions. I don't know if the space to be that kind of dandy, flaneur person taking this in, I just feel like that's a shrinking island. And that's why people are fighting so hard over what your essay means.
We're talking the whole time about the politics of the piece or the art in question. I think another huge part of what I'm saying is part of what changed in 10 years is that art became incredibly formally conservative. We should talk about the art itself. There was a huge change in terms of what art became. It's just so regressive, and it's so like formally, aesthetically conservative. It's quite dandyish art, dare I say. It's decorative, pretty, empty art. It's this combination of like very sellable, dandyish, pretty empty objects being posited as revolutionary tools. That is a crazy combination, and that can't hold up. I think there should be space in art discourse to talk about art itself and talk about how it's changed and how it's become so nostalgic and backwards looking. And in the many responses I've had, many people like you are explaining how we got here, how I've misrepresented or misinterpreted how we got here. But I haven't felt a great disagreement of where we are. I think people seem to be broadly in agreement that art is in a particularly kind of flaccid, low energy place. Nobody's come back to me and defended the shows themselves. Nobody's said the Whitney Biennial or the Venice Biennale were good. The Venice Biennale was all right, actually, but nobody's defending them. Everyone's saying, yeah, of course they're terrible. Why is he even talking about it? They're so irrelevant. Like, they're the worst shows. Of course they're useless shows. We all know that. But I think that's significant. So much the discourse is about the politics of the piece or like the stupidity of the argument, but no one's really defending the art or the forms the art has taken, and no one's willing to stand up and make a case for them. Maybe critics should be doing. The institutions that put on these shows certainly should be standing up and making a strong case for what they're showing and why they're showing it, because that is literally their job. You say there's no space for the dandyish critic, art lover.
I mean, space for them without it being immediately taken up in these kind of arguments about
I think that's a problem, that like now, if you care about art, most of all, that will be interpreted as a reactionary position or some kind of like hidden fascism. I think that's a problem. I think the idea that art for art's sake is something we should fight against, because that will be bad for art. That will be bad for art. And it's also like, you shouldn't give conservatives that. You shouldn't say, here, you have art. That's something that could backfire as well. You take beauty, you take newness, you take art for art's sake. That all belongs to you guys now. Like, I think that is a bad way for things to go.
I for sure agree with that. I actually agree with that strongly. I mean, I think the lack of discussion of form or what makes art compelling, the flattening of the discourse to be kind of like press releases for like pat on the head, progressive narrative. You know, if you buy this, then you're on this right side of history, but not really explaining what makes something good or formally what it does. Yeah, all that is like really important. If you don't understand how things you disagree with are compelling, then you can never possibly figure out how to make art that you do agree with that's compelling. I think there's a real part of the recent conversation that is exactly that art has become flat because it has seeded the conversation about form and transgression, edginess, whatever people get, whatever turns them on, to just coded it as reactionary. And then you have a discourse that feels very safe that people want to reject. But I guess I'm just saying, you can't not have the conversation. I think that it is impossible to not have the conversation, to not differentiate one's critique of aesthetics, of one's call for, art that is more formally interesting, however you want to call that, from certain kinds of return to beauty and so on, which are, like you said, like doing some pretty unnerving things. It's impossible to opt out of that discussion. Be like, we're just going to have a conversation about beauty that kind of exists over here, because different people, whether you like it or not, people are claiming that conversation. There are people who hate identity politics because they don't like the people who have those identities. That is absolutely true. And who embrace the critique of recent identity politics in art because they're just like, I'm not interested in indigenous people, Mm-hmm. There are very real limits to some of the ways indigeneity is talked about. I think it's an interesting conversation to have, but it's absolutely important to engage how these things are being talked about. And there are people who speak in code who are trying to, when they say beauty, they really mean Greek statues and so on, and all that means.
Yeah, I mean, as a critic, you can't, you could reject all these things, but it's hard to reject all these things. It would be stupid as a critic to say, oh, all political art is bad, because it's not true. It would be a stupid thing to say. I do think there would be space for an artist to reject the idea that art should be political, reject the idea that they can't just make art for art's space. There would be space for a movement to do that, even for a group of people to write a manifesto. That would be interesting to see. Also, I don't think the kind of shallow, superficial 2024-5 forms of political art institutions is the biggest problem in art. But I think it was the most important thing to talk about. I'm really talking about two biennials. It's a specific part of the art world, but these are also the biggest exhibitions in the world. What's going on in the galleries is worse, I think. What's going on in the fairs is clearly worse. And that has little to nothing to do with politics being put into art. The flatness, the low energy, aspects of contemporary art today are pretty widespread. They're throughout the institutions and throughout the market. We know why things are bad in the market. We know about the kind of speculation and the hollowing out into just pure flat painted commodity. So it's not that interesting to write about, maybe. But, it seems like contemporary art is deep into a crisis at the moment. Maybe it's about to change. I would hope that's, part of the big reaction to the piece is actually about that. There's just not energy there. It's not where the energy is. There's a sense of exhaustion in museums and outside of them.
Well, I have so much more I want to ask you. I guess the last thing I'll ask you then is about social media and online stuff, because you've said elsewhere, not in this text, but in The Drift, you had an essay saying, basically what you said just now, which is that contemporary art is at a point of exhaustion, but what feels really vital is online stuff. There is experimental energy. It's just all online. And I myself have this question, because how much of it is that no good art is being made, or how much of it is it's just not in the spaces people expect, or that somehow the art critical conversation has moved online that now rewards certain kinds of very flashy conversations and doesn't reward kind of the deeper experience that people associate with good art. But at the same time, there's all this online subculture that feels very vital to people. And maybe that's part of why people feel recent art is flat, is because there is this more vital stuff that you're constantly immersed in. I think you've talked about this in other writings about how what feels vital to you is these kind of experimental narrations of yourself as a character.
I think that's where cultural production is right now, is online. And I don't mean by that it's art. I'm not saying that people performing characters online is art. Could be, could not. I think it's like a different form of cultural production. I'm not saying that short form video, people making video edits on Instagram or TikTok, it does not have the depth of a great work of art. but it can be incredible. It can have an amazing effect, an amazing power. It's not that I think like the online cultural production is art. It's not that I think it belongs in the museums, though maybe some of it could be exhibited in museums. Maybe it'd be good, but it kind of defeats the point of what that is.
Yep.
I just think that's where cultural production is now. And I think, we spoke about Hannah Black's protest being the biggest thing that happened in art in the 2010s. But I think when we tell the story of art and culture in the 2010s, it's going to be a story about social media. We're not going to be talking much about exhibitions or albums or movies even. Like when we look back on the 2010s and 2020s too and say, what was going on in culture? Well, it was internet, it was social media in particular, user-generated content, and it changed the world and it changed culture, and like our self-expression moved into different places. But this is the way we kind of live between realms. It's completely changed how we conceptualize ourselves. It's changed our identity and how we think about identity. It's really rich, fertile ground for artists to explore, actually, in ways that do not need to involve the internet or technology at all. But the ways in which selfhood and identity have changed is fascinating. It's rich ground for writers, for artists, but it doesn't get explored much in the big exhibitions. I don't see much art actually going into identity beyond the obvious markers, going into like excavating the contemporary condition, what it is to be a person now. People say the internet is dead, right? Or they say social media is over, and maybe, I still like Twitter, but it's pretty fucked. It's a mess, and like Facebook's long gone. Instagram feels pretty over, and TikTok is about to be banned. So there's no new platform. There is a sense that whole social media is also like, that's a kind of washed up millennial concern. But what happens? There's a lot of space in culture opening up again for art or for something else or for something different.
Maybe so. That it seems to me the new vibe shift really is that the last period was politics putting this intense pressure on art in many ways through social media, and art kind of like flattening down and splintering because of that. And then this period seems like now politics has put intense pressure on social media and it has splintered and broken down. And then what comes next? What weird communities feel vital in the wake of that? I don't know, but it's going to be pretty wild. Dean, we've gone on way too long. Thank you so much for talking to me, having this conversation debate.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review the show. It helps other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Caroline Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening. See you next week.